everyone. My name is Erin Lavender, and I'm the product manager here at Double the Donation. I'm really excited to show to you today just a quick walkthrough of some new features that we have in Double the Donation's volunteering module. I have Double the Donation pulled up right now. I'm going to click over to volunteering here real quick so I can show you some of what we've implemented in the last week or so. If you're familiar with Double the Donation's product, then you're aware that in the matching gifts realm, we help organizations raise more from matching gifts by helping them reach out to their donors at the time of donation to help them discover their eligibility, share where they work, and then pursue the next steps that they may need to take for their workplace giving program. Our goal is to do the same thing with volunteers for programs that may be eligible for, like volunteer PTO and volunteer grant programs that could be available to them from their employer. So one thing that we have been able to implement very recently is volunteer grant stages and new email streams as well in the volunteering module. If you've been using the volunteering module in the past, then you may be aware that while we were able to receive volunteer registration data from our integration partners and via CSV imports, we were not yet able to track the status of activity with volunteer grant progress. Now that we've implemented some new updates, we are happy to say that we are able to track that status so that you can pursue those volunteer grants with a more granular and specific eye to what action has your volunteer taken, what action have they not yet taken, and what action could we encourage them to take in the near future. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this table here. As you can see, I navigated to the volunteering module and then went to the registrations tab. And you'll see here the registrations tab table with a record of all of the donation registrations that have come in from your integrated volunteer management system. What you may see here that's a bit new is the volunteer grant stage and potentially the employer identification column as well, if you haven't seen that yet perusing this area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the volunteer grant stage. If you're familiar with the matching module, this probably looks really familiar to you as well. But the volunteer grant stage tracks, one, of course, whether or not we have identified the employer of the volunteer in question, and then two, what steps has that volunteer taken based on their eligibility to actually submit their volunteer grant request to their employer. So here in the volunteer grant stage, you've got a couple of different stages to choose from. I'm using kind of the manual edit function here in the registrations table just to show you all of your options, but I'll distinguish between which ones are automated and which ones are fully manual at this time. So the first one we have, of course, is employer identification in progress. This is the stage that the volunteer grant is in, of course, when we don't yet know where this volunteer works. So for example, here we've got Les. Les had not yet shared his employer name, and therefore the stage here is employer identification in progress. Let's say we do know where the volunteer works and they are eligible for a volunteer grant from their employer. That would then put them automatically in the bucket of waiting for volunteer. So we know where they work. We know that this person is eligible for a volunteer grant, but maybe they haven't taken any activity that we've been able to track yet, that they've started the process of submitting their volunteer grant submission yet to their employer. If they do take some action to submit their volunteer grant request to their employer, we will then automatically move the status to volunteer grant submission initiated. This would be, say, if they click on go to volunteer grant form in our plugin, it takes some kind of next step in response to our automated email streams. They can move to this volunteer grant submission initiated stage. They can, of course, also, in response to automated emails we send, let your organization know that they did submit their volunteer grant request to their employer. And if they do so, we can add the tag of volunteer verified to the volunteer grant stage here. So those are kind of your initial automated statuses, right? Employer identification in progress, waiting for volunteer, volunteer grant submission initiated, and volunteer grant submission initiated, volunteer verified. After here, there's a couple of manual statuses we can look at. So if you as an organization really love to kind of do your homework and use your Double the Donation account to track the disbursement of the actual volunteer grant or matching gift funds from the employer, you may come back in and in the matching module, you may say like match approved, pending payment, match received, statuses like that or stages like that. In the volunteering registrations table, you can do the same thing. So you can come back in and add these manual statuses or apply these status manually for volunteer grant approved, pending payment, volunteer grant complete, or volunteer grant denied. Again, these are manual stages that you would go in as an organization to update depending on the updates you may receive from that volunteer's employer. One more kind of manual status or manual stage that you have access to is ineligible for volunteer grant, did not attend. So let's say you're managing the attendance lists and you want to pull everyone who didn't actually show up to the volunteer event. Maybe there was a mix-up, maybe something came up and they had a conflict, were not able to join to volunteer for your organization, and you want to eliminate them from kind of the list of eligible volunteers. You can update the stage here as ineligible for volunteer grant, did not attend. And then lastly here, let's say we find a employer for the volunteer, but that employer does not have a volunteer grant program. They will be marked as ineligible for volunteer grant, no grant available. This is like the last automated status here. So you have all of these statuses available to you, all of these stages available to you, some of which are automated based on volunteer activity and eligibility, and some are manual based on your own preference for bookkeeping and keeping track of the disbursement process for those volunteer grants. Second thing I want to go through are some of the new automated emails available. So if you're familiar with the volunteering module, you are aware that we had 2 email streams that were available to turn on, and we encouraged you to turn both of them on. First was volunteer incentives available, and the second was discover volunteer incentives. Discover volunteer incentives specifically applies to volunteers who are in that employer identification in progress stage, right? These are folks that we don't yet know where they work, and we would like to, so we can start encouraging them to pursue whatever workplace giving program is the most lucrative to them. Of course, in this context, it would be volunteer grants. This email stream has been untouched, still available, and you're able to use this for volunteers who fall into that category. You may see in volunteer incentives available a couple of new options available to you. The volunteer incentives available email stream before we made some updates is of course still kind of that general email that goes out and says, hey, you may be eligible for a volunteer incentive program. And this could cover volunteer time off, but this could also cover volunteer grants. And we kind of smush them together into the same email. There's benefits to this, but it may also not be exactly how you want to manage your pursuit for volunteer grants or volunteer time off. So what we've done is we've added some additional options for you so that you can decide how you'd like to manage your volunteering program or your volunteer grant program, your volunteer time off program. So here we've got volunteer incentives available. If you still want to send that single email that covers both VTO and volunteer grants, you're able to do so and nothing has changed. However, if you would prefer instead to send a specific email for volunteer grants or a specific email for volunteer time off, or 2 emails separately for both of those that maybe are staggered, you are able to do that now with our 2 new email streams. First is volunteer grant available, and second is volunteer time off available. You can see the previews in your Double the Donation account, but as you can see, this email speaks specifically about volunteer grants. It allows you to start the volunteer grant process and now allows you to verify that you've submitted your volunteer grant request, or I should say allows your volunteers to do so. So here you're able to kind of start that process, or volunteers are able to start that process and really hone in specifically on the program that they're eligible for volunteer grants. All of these emails are also connected, of course, to the volunteer grant stages that are included, except for the volunteer time off email, of course, because it does not include any information about volunteer grants. So let's say your organization isn't really focused on volunteer time off. You don't really care to talk about it, aren't really worried about it. You're very focused on volunteer grants. Maybe you want to turn on the volunteer grant available email alone and not turn on the volunteer time off email. Maybe you're really into discussing both of these volunteer incentive programs, but you'd be super interested in first really giving VTO its time to shine, and then waiting a little while, and then sharing information about the volunteer grant program so that they can be staggered, have their own messaging, and really be focused in that way. You can turn on both the volunteer time off available email stream and the volunteer grant available email stream. Or let's say you really like the current volunteer incentives available email as is. You want to talk about both of these programs at the same time in a single consolidated email. You can keep your volunteer incentives available email stream open and keep the other two off. My personal recommendation is that you don't have all three of these on at the same time. I think it would be a bit of an overload of information, potentially a bit of a redundancy as well. We don't want to confuse our volunteers. I would take a look at this more as, hey, you have three options for which you can kind of mix and match what works best for you, depending on what you'd like to emphasize, what you'd like to separate out, and how many emails you'd prefer to send to your volunteer base. That was a walkthrough of our new volunteer grant stages and our new specific volunteering email streams. Of course, if you have more questions, please feel free to reach out to your representative at Double the Donation, and we'll be happy to help you share some best practices and get you started with raising more from volunteer grants and getting more from volunteer time off. Again, this is Erin Lavender with the Double the Donation product team. Thanks for spending some time with me today.